Chapter 5. The London Summit. In December 2019, a group of Bournemouth University students attended NATO's summit in London and were given the chance to put their questions and concerns to senior NATO officials, journalists and experts. NATO has long realised that its legitimacy and existence now depend on the support of the public and especially young people. Engagement has become one of the key objectives of the organisation in the digital age. The London meeting was billed as an historic moment for the alliance. It was supposed to celebrate NATO's 70th anniversary and to welcome its 30th member.
The NATO Leadership Meeting taking place in London in December was very much hoped to celebrate the accession of North Macedonia. And of course, sadly, because of various political reasons, they're not going to be able to formalise that at this stage. But there's a sense very much that this will be a meeting of the 29 plus 1 rather than the 30 that was originally imagined.
However, the delayed accession of North Macedonia was not the only complication. A few days before the leaders' meeting in London, French President Emmanuel Macron gave an interview in which he called NATO brain dead. On the eve of the summit, Turkish President Erdogan threatened to block an agreement for NATO to defend the Baltic states in case of a Russian attack. Meanwhile, the requirement for each NATO partner to contribute 2% of their GDP to defence continued to be a controversial topic, as most countries failed to reach that goal. Personal tensions between leaders during the summit grabbed the headlines, as the world's media continued to analyse their body language and comments about each other. Yet these seemingly superficial incidents masked much more profound differences, contrasting visions about the future of European security, about the role of the United States in Europe, and about NATO's strategy towards Russia. Many saw NATO as facing an existential crisis.
Crisis is a regular feature throughout NATO's history. Certainly, we are at the moment in which three leaders of the alliance, Trump, Macron, but also Erdogan, are asking pretty fundamental questions about why their countries should be part of this structure. At the level of the organization, at the level of the eastern flank, the southern dimension, the investments, NATO continues as it has been continuing. But at the level of the politics, I think we are in the middle of a crisis, and that would be the moment for the leaders to do something about their egos, to think in broader terms about the interest of their countries and about the interest of the alliance, and go a little bit above the next soundbite or the next tweet, and think about what's the strategic relationship that keeps all of our countries together in NATO.
Yeah, I think NATO has got big problems, and they are political problems, but they feed into its day-to-day military deployments and its military strategy. It has problems because the commitment of the United States is more uncertain than it's been perhaps in NATO's history. There are also big discussions in Europe about whether there is a need for a strategic rethink, particularly of the relationship between NATO and the European Union. There are new threats. Of course, NATO is very used to dealing with the threat that is perceived to come from Russia and from Moscow. But now there are a whole raft of new challenges, from cybersecurity to hybrid warfare to the challenges presented to the south of the NATO region in Africa, North and Sub-Saharan Africa. So NATO, I think, is at a time of trying to figure out what its 21st century purpose really is, and that involves a lot of internal discussion.
I don't think that NATO at that stage is facing an existential crisis, since it's able to cope with every new challenges. It's the only sole institution that represents 40 trillion US dollar of goods, almost 1 billion people, and securing all this geography and area, there isn't a second institution that may be able to cope or to compete with NATO. NATO is here, NATO is live, and it's normal that there are some debate, but at the end of the day, you see the family picture, everyone hugs each other, and it is normal that every leader show that they're ready to also protect their national interest. This is valid for President Erdogan, as for President Trump, or for Emmanuel Macron, or for Angela Merkel.
I've just come off a platform talking with two NATO leaders, the President of Poland and the Prime Minister of what is about to be the newest member of NATO, North Macedonia. And of course the instinctive impulse of politicians is to tell me and other journalists that things are fine. That, you know, don't pay attention to the apparent divisions and the words that seem to be at odds with each other. The truth is we're absolutely committed and united to, you know, a common future in NATO. You need to get beyond that to actually get real about what is happening, the new challenges, and how NATO may have to adapt and evolve and change to cope with a changing world. So, you know, it's incumbent on people like me in the journalist profession to dig a little deeper, to brief ourselves, research carefully what is actually going on the ground, say in northern Syria, or on Europe's eastern flank, where, you know, the fear is that Russia has the capacity to really threaten the Baltic states or Poland. We need to look carefully at the balance of power. We need to look at what politicians are saying, not just in these NATO summits, but back home to their own people. And we need to sort of hold those in power to account.
Part of the challenge facing NATO may be that since the end of the Cold War, different regions of the alliance face different threats.
There are now security differences among the members because the one common enemy, the Soviet Union, that bound everybody together has gone, and there's now a multitude of challenges. And of course, where you stand geographically is where you sit, right? So you're in Portugal, you're in Spain, and it's not Russia that you're worried about. It's the problems of jihadism, of instability, of uncontrolled migration, of organised crime, of human trafficking. You know, coming across the Mediterranean, you take a quick flight from Madrid up to Tallinn in Estonia and get out the plane, and of course it's Russia. It's the history of Russian occupation, it's the Russian forces just over the border, it's the antagonism over many bilateral issues. So it's more complicated today because clearly countries don't have the same priority list of threats that they had during the Cold War, and they want NATO to address their particular threat. So NATO has to be more things to more people than ever before, and finding a balance in all of that and maintaining coherence, I think, is one of the problems first and foremost.
At the heart of the debate about Europe's security lies the question of how to deal with Russia, as different leaders favour different approaches, ranging from dialogue and engagement to containment and deterrence.
Well, the main idea that I'm hearing here, you know, not to talk about money problem and financial issues and so on, is Russia. And the problem is that Russia is declared as a problem and a threat, but we can see that there is no common idea of the plan how to challenge this and what to do with Russia.
It's the usual sort of situation, the default position for NATO to look very carefully and skeptically at what Russia does. That's normal, that's not new. What is new and perhaps disturbing for supporters of NATO is that there is such disunity within.
I think it depends on where you happen to live in Europe. So the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and co, they all probably feel that collective defence is more important because they can see a worrying trend in terms of Russian military developments, in terms of Russian political developments. That makes them feel quite uncomfortable, and therefore they are looking to the collective umbrella of NATO and in particular the US to be able to provide that credible deterrent effect so that they can continue to live as part of the Anglosphere and the European Union, as opposed to being sucked back into a Russian sphere of influence.
I think what Putin needs is he needs disunity in the Western world, and so the last couple of years have been like something from a KGB dream of the 1970s and 1980s. You read their kind of secret memos, and it's all about attacking NATO, dividing Paris from Washington, causing rifts between European countries and North America.
We can see that new leaders, they are very pragmatic. They say that they don't care about Crimea annexation. They don't say it, directly, but we have this feeling, people who work in Russia, who understand the issues and problems of Russia.
The NATO leaders' competing visions may represent conflicting national interests, which is a reminder that today's world is very different to that of when NATO was founded. The framework of international laws, agreements and treaties that was put together after World War II is under attack. Intergovernmental and international organizations are facing a crisis of legitimacy, leadership and moral credibility amongst the global public.
It's obviously also the case that as time passes, people look at international organisations in less romantic, sentimental terms and more transactionally. For example, when I was 20, the European Union was about peace in Europe. It was about no more Second World Wars. And I think even in NATO, there was that legacy of the Second World War, of the Allies, the US, Canada, the UK, fighting together against Nazism and so on. But today it's changed. You're absolutely correct there. Politicians in all countries look more at what do I put in, what do I get out? Does it put more restrictions on me than it brings advantages? The grocer's sheet, if you like, of cost and loss of benefit and that type of balance.
Does that then mean that French President Macron was right to warn that NATO is becoming brain dead? And how helpful was that intervention?
I certainly don't regard it as brain dead. I mean, there are some problems. And some of those problems are not down to NATO, but they are down to individual leaders within NATO and their ability to remember that they have allies and need from time to talk to them.
Europe would be a much less stable place were NATO to be, as President Macron recently said, brain dead. I think the general consensus would probably be that NATO provides a collective security umbrella that nothing else comes close to achieving. And certainly nothing that the European Defence Association, the European Union or any other solely European organisation can hope to replicate in the foreseeable future.
No, it's obviously not brain dead. I mean, I read President Macron's Economist interview very carefully, and also in the original French, and it was a kind of plea, a statement of frustration against a lot of big things. The absence of leadership in the EU, he feels very alone. The lack of European willingness to stand on Europe's own feet in a more dangerous world, particularly around Europe. Look at the Middle East, Russia, North Africa, and so on. The decline of the multilateral institutions. And he then sort of turned to NATO and blamed NATO as if NATO was responsible for this situation, which clearly it isn't. And when he also questioned Article 5, the NATO mutual insurance clause, I thought that was irresponsible. You don't go around in your village announcing to every burglar that the burglar alarm on your house is no longer working. So please, burglars, come and try to get into my house. I mean, I don't think that's very wise to do politically. In fact, one thing that Macron's statement has done, paradoxically, is induce every NATO leader, including President Trump, to say how wonderful and important and necessary NATO is. So in a way, ironically, Macron has given NATO its best PR campaign that it's enjoyed for many years.
Behind President Macron's statement lies a more fundamental question about the relationship between the United States and Europe.
What President Macron, in his recent words on NATO and Europe, what he's pointing to is a big discussion right now about whether Europe can rely upon and see the United States as a full-on partner, security partner in the future as it has in the past. That's really what so much of this is about. Macron's message to Europe seems to be we have to more and more rely upon ourselves in Europe. We have to have a coherent European security strategy as opposed to a NATO security strategy.
Yet, not everyone is convinced that Europe can go it alone. The European Union's track record on common foreign and defence policy is weak.
The US has been fabulously generous over the decades in supporting us and in keeping Europe peaceable. And the EU absolutely has played a huge role in that by providing economic stability. But it would be as naught if we didn't have the physical security. And that sort of lack of collective capability within Europe, even when the same countries are involved in NATO, is something that I think is really interesting. Almost a concept of autonomous dependence. So we sit there like a you know, I suppose it's almost the equivalent of a teenage child demanding his or her independence in the family, but not having the resources, the knowledge, or the will to then be able to actually utilise that independence.
At the same time, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe still wish the US and Canada to remain a core part of Europe's security architecture.
For us, it's important that Canada stays engaged with European security, that we have Canadian troops in Latvia as part of the NATO forward presence, but most importantly, that both the United States and Canada stay committed to the transatlantic relations, which for us is not a bargain, it's not a transaction. It's a relationship that's based on history, it's based on value.
Our investigation indicates that public displays of disunity among Western leaders are having a negative effect on public perceptions of NATO's ability to tackle the threat from Russia. The perception prevalent among the young people we interviewed was that NATO is slow to respond to threats.
I think I would ask a NATO leader that, given the kind of lack of support and backing behind NATO currently, do they think that they'd actually be in a position to protect European security effectively?
If I could ask one question to a NATO official, I would say, is NATO in a current state to resist Russian aggression?
We put that question to James Apathurai, NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs.
I've heard all the debate, you've heard all the debate, but when it comes down to what people like me do, which is the hard facts, we have put our forces on a higher level of readiness. We have pushed our forces also out to the east of the alliance and multinational forces, so everybody's involved. We have beefed up our plans to be able to defend each other. We're working on building on our reinforcement capabilities, so we have new headquarters for supporting each other, and I could go on and on. Cyber defenses, space defenses. So we definitely have the capabilities, and regardless of the political discussion, we have troops out there on the line, meaning any attack on a NATO ally will get a response from all allies. So I'm actually quite convinced that we have what it takes to defend the alliance and to deter an attack against the alliance.
This declared position, we defend ourselves from Russia, and simultaneously we have a dialogue with Russia. It's declared by Stoltenberg and others. It's nothing, like it's just words, you know. Now, in reality, there is no plan.
During the NATO Leaders Meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron argued that the West should pursue dialogue with Russia.
We're working and having concrete discussions with Russia on certain issues. We've been working with this power on several issues.
The prospect of engaging in a dialogue with the Russian government, while it continues to pursue a campaign of disinformation and influence across Europe, is controversial. Given President Putin's strategy over the past 2 decades, should the West try to engage in dialogue with Russia? And if so, what would be the point of that dialogue?
With Russian president, nothing works except a strong position. I mean, no dialogue, so, you know, please do that, or please do this, so come on. No, he is the guy from different mentality, and he needs to understand, and he needs to be spoken with strong words, understandable choices.
I think it's important to keep dialogue going between Putin's Russia and the West, because that keeps the bedrock of deterrence alive. While there is communication, there can be reassurance where necessary that actually we in the West are not going to make a land grab for Kaliningrad, for example. Likewise, there needs to be some dialogue coming from Russia that says when they position batteries of missiles in Kaliningrad that have a range that could now hit Western Europe, that if you don't have dialogue, you don't have understanding of what the rationale is for that. Is the rationale because Russia genuinely feels under threat from the West? Or is it that Putin is looking to consolidate and cement and strengthen his power at home, and it sends a clear signal to his voters that he is prepared to stand up for Russia? So one has to at least keep a dialogue going so that you understand why things are being done.
There is some dialogue. I mean, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe still meets in Vienna. There will be several meetings every week at which NATO countries, non-NATO countries, Russia, all of the countries of the former Soviet Union and the Western Balkans and so on will all be around a single table. And I think those are extremely important. What you don't really have at the moment is any concrete negotiations trying to reach some specific objective. But you need to have some understanding of what it is that you're reaching towards. What do you want to achieve?
I don't see any way with this present regime of having dialogue, as President Macron wants, or reaching mutual solutions. Putin's not interested in mutual solutions. He is interested in dividing and undermining Western institutions, of putting NATO in a box, of fueling division inside the European Union, and so on. And so you have to kind of contain him in some way. And the best way of doing that, I think, is not through hot war, but through smart countermeasures.
Our students questioned the extent to which the West is able to effectively retaliate and therefore deter Russia in cases such as the Salisbury attack against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
I'd ask them, do they think their retaliation to Russia and the Salisbury events, do they think their retaliation was enough? Obviously, I know they had to be quite careful and they didn't want to overreact, but personally, from my point of view, I don't think they did enough in retaliation. They just sort of let them get away with it, and I think that's what it seems to the public.
To be honest, I hope it was adequate. What I can say, it was much more than we've ever done before against something like that. So what did we do? Of course, there was strong political solidarity with the United Kingdom. It goes without saying. Second, NATO joined in the decision to expel a number of Russians who had been using their diplomatic cover to conduct activities that were not diplomatic. And that was part of a much wider expulsion. And we have a clear understanding that this has diminished aggressive, illegal Russian intelligence activities in many of our countries. But third, we've also stepped up our support to allies when it comes to defending against chemical weapons. And we've stepped up our political support for the organization that deals with chemical weapons. So I think we've really done our best.
I think Salisbury is a good example where the UK government very quickly declassified the evidence, collected all the evidence, came to NATO, but also the EU, and laid the evidence on the table and said, look, we know that Russia was behind this, and NATO allies, will you then take collective measures, not just the UK, collective measures, because the same thing could have happened to you in Paris or Berlin, and NATO collectively expelled hundreds of Russian diplomats, which I think probably took Putin by surprise.
French President Macron is not the only leader advocating a softer approach towards Russia. US President Donald Trump has often clashed with his own intelligence community on whether Russia constitutes a threat to the West. Some have gone as far as to suggest that Trump is too close to Russian President Putin.
Is President Trump under Russian influence? That's a bit like saying, you know, is the Pope a little bit fond of God? Of course he is. I mean, you can read Mueller, which talks about sweeping and systematic interference by Russia in the election. Now, Mueller, in the end, concluded that there wasn't enough proof to reach criminal level standard, but there's certainly an awful lot of smoke, multiple interactions between Trump people and Russian assets and known spies, oligarch intermediaries and so on, plus a huge social media campaign run out of St. Petersburg to boost Trump, which has all been kind of unpicked. This is the biggest mystery of 21st century politics. You know, Trump is so rude about everybody. I mean, he may not have been rude about you yet, or me personally, but he's rude about practically the whole world. The one individual he's consistently nice about, obsequious about, is Vladimir Putin. Now, is that because Putin is the most charming person on the planet? No. It's because, actually, the FSB, KGB compromat file on Donald Trump is bigger than this building. I mean, it's enormous.
Yeah, there's a bit of a paradox here, I know, because I think President Trump would like to have good relations with Putin, but, you know, he gets mugged by reality, as we all do. And the reality is that Russia has interfered in the American election campaign in a very hostile way and continues to do so, according to American intelligence agencies. And Trump's own Republican Party it has imposed sanctions on Russia for that. He's seen Russia violate arms control treaties like the INF Treaty, which Trump has now withdrawn from. He's seen Russia hostile behavior in Eastern Europe. And so the paradox is that Trump may say, yes, I want to get on with Russia, but he recently sent 1,000 extra American troops to Poland. In the last couple of weeks, he sent 650 extra American troops to Lithuania. Next year, he's sending 40,000 US troops over to Europe for the biggest American reinforcement exercise since the end of the Cold War. So, you know, Trump may have his aspirations, but the reality is that Russia is a challenger. And the behavior of Trump, whether it be in Syria, where American forces have fired upon Russian mercenaries who came too close to them, or whether it be in Eastern Europe, the behavior of Trump is very much to contain Russian power. And as long as we can look to what Trump does as much as what he says, I think the allies can be basically reassured.
We're worried about the attitude of President Trump towards NATO, that hopefully right now we see it reversed and we see President Trump embracing NATO. So for us, I think it's a good way to resolve issues through direct discussions.
Well, I think President Trump likes to be a disruptor because he thinks disruption works. I mean, if you meet President Trump and say, President Trump, does polite talk get you anywhere? Does being sweet and reasonable really make your allies do what you want them to do? He would probably say no. Disruption, shock therapy, tough medicine, you know, impolite talk is necessary because I get their attention in a way that President Obama or George W. Bush or my predecessors didn't. So Trump believes that this shock therapy works, and frankly, there is some evidence to say that he's right. For instance, under his watch, over the last 3 years, the Allies have spent now $130 billion more on defence. When Trump took office, the number of allies who were at the 2% of GDP on defence, apart from the United States, was only 3. Today it's 9. So Trump would say, hey, you know, this is working. You know, I may be a bit sort of rude on occasion, but they are recognising that the days when they could rely on America providing 70% 2% of the collective budgets, providing 70% of all the important military assets that were required for NATO's defence. You know, the days when we could basically bankroll NATO and give the Europeans sort of free security, you know, time is up on that.
As with other issues, the requirement for each NATO member state to contribute 2% of its GDP to defence has become a proxy for more fundamental questions about the future of European security and about the role of NATO as a community of partners who share responsibilities and values.
I do believe all NATO countries should be achieving that 2% ambition. We Europeans have to recognise we have to pay for our security as much as our partners.
It's a headmark that is politically very easy to talk about and relatively easy for the general population to understand. It makes life much simpler to be able to say, okay, the US is overachieving, the UK is just about achieving, the Germans are underachieving, and if one then looks at everybody contributing towards their collective defence, if a country is only contributing 1% and another country is contributing 4%, then one has to ask, is the country contributing 1% doing enough to actually bolster the collective security of Europe and also bolster its own security? So the free-riding argument that has been made by President Trump and others for much of Europe and its approach to defence over the last 20 years, I think is a very valid question.
If there was one thing emphasised by the students we spoke to, that was the question of values. The public do not necessarily distinguish between domestic and foreign policy. NATO is just one more element of a political and institutional system that appears broken. Widespread scepticism towards government and traditional carriers of authority and power is also affecting young people's perceptions of NATO.
Values are extremely important, but when we see that the governments of our nations and the nations that are neighbouring to us are in disarray, when we see that our politicians no longer represent us, but represent an unknown group of people, all of whom have way more money and power, which you can see why they're representing them. When you can see that you pay loads of taxes and you see your streets in disrepair and your medical services cut and your student loans having an increasing amount of interest, it's very hard to make them convinced that these values are something that you should be fighting for.
Values are a very underlying purpose for everything people do, and that's equally applicable to NATO as a multinational organisation. The number one values for NATO are preserving peace and freedom of the individuals in its member states. I think that is, however, sort of taken for granted a lot of the time.
I think the point about values is fundamental and at the heart of NATO. The key point here is that we do share values and we have acted upon those values. Now, are there differences between the member states? Of course there are. Even between the type of electoral system, the way the structure of government is run. Bottom line is you can take all of those differences, but at the end of the day, these are all still democratic states, and that is the key. It's been mentioned here today, it's been mentioned by the Secretary General, and the key point is that differences does not make an alliance necessarily weaker. In fact, if you address those differences, if you confront those differences, you actually become stronger.
There are problems, but there were problems before. You know, NATO managed to survive the colonel's coup in Greece. It managed to survive the fact that, you know, for the first 3 decades, I suppose, of its existence, Portugal was ruled by a dictatorship. So, you know, one shouldn't exaggerate the extent to which everybody in NATO has always agreed about values. NATO can't throw people out. It doesn't have, I mean, it has even less than the EU by way of tools for disciplining members for things that they do internally. But there is still a kind of moral weight to what NATO does and what NATO representatives say, and I think sometimes that's something that they could probably use a little more.
I would say actually the values bit that the young people you have interviewed, they've absolutely nailed it. It is the most important bit, because the values are what separates us from an autocracy. So I think when it comes to NATO, that one of the things that has damaged it is that Afghanistan has been a messy campaign. Although there has undoubtedly been a huge amount of good done, there's been collateral damage and casualties and things that sort of have caused people to question whether we are genuinely a force for good. And I think Iraq was in many ways sort of a much more difficult campaign in that respect. And so that has damaged trust in governmental institutions. I think it's damaged trust in the military. It's damaged trust in supranational organisations like NATO. So it's very important that NATO regains that trust, so that the people who are reaching adulthood today and tomorrow, and who will form the soldiers, sailors and airmen, and parts of industry and parts of the public service that make up the defence enterprise in the future, believe in what we're doing. And belief is very important to deterrence, because if we don't believe in it, then there is little deterrent effect.
It does seem to me that the values issue is very important. And when I read President Macron's interview with The Economist, there's quite a lot in there that I could agree with in terms of Europe having to do more for itself. But one thing that I thought he got wrong was to suggest that Europe could or should be equidistant between the United States and China. I mean, it seems to me that at the end of the day, whatever disagreements we have with Donald Trump's America, and God knows I have many disagreements with Donald Trump's America and policies that Trump is pursuing on climate change, on migration and so on, in the end, China remains an authoritarian state which is at the moment imprisoning perhaps up to 1 million of its people in Xinjiang in order to, let's call it, brainwash them into believing in a certain kind of China. China is not a democracy. It does not share our values. And we can have family disputes with the United States, but that's rather a different thing from the kind of disagreements of principle that we're going to have with China if it continues on its current course.
The role of China as a competitor and possible threat is also at the heart of debates around European security and NATO's future role.
China has become, in some ways, the Soviet Union of this generation. It is a huge power. It is a competitor. They have a military capability growing beyond anything that the West can really conceive of, because that is what the government has decided is a priority for them. We are, however, in a way that was not the case with the Soviet Union, inextricably linked to China because of our trade issues. We are probably, everybody in this room where we are talking is using Chinese-made equipment, is wearing Chinese clothes, China is embedded into our society at a whole variety of levels. Now, that doesn't mean that everything China does should be welcomed and endorsed and or a blind eye turned. It would be very foolish to disregard China right now, and it is clearly a priority for the NATO leaders. But it's a lot harder to balance one's views on the treatment of civilians when one is benefiting from what China brings, and that's a very tricky path to walk.
If NATO wishes to engage younger audiences, then it will itself have to engage more meaningfully with the question of which values it represents in the 21st century, and how it can ensure that these are nurtured and adhered to by member states. For many young people, questions of security and defence are not separate from other public affairs, such as sustainability and the environment.
I'm passionate about climate change, and I think that's a very relevant topic to now.
especially with stuff like Extinction Rebellion happening and Greta Thunberg being on the news so much. I think it's something that NATO could work strongly with to help sort of connect people and to sort of spread awareness of them, and not just necessarily focusing on the security side of things, but to help other problems that are going on in the world.
People could argue that it is thanks to the NATO preserving the values of peace and freedom that organisations such as Extinction Rebellion, who are the sort of lead advocates for sustainability and a newer, greener environment, are able to protest and make their case in the way that they do. And so it's NATO's responsibility to really make sure that that environment exists. I've never yet sat in a meeting of sort of military purposes where sustainability has been discussed. And I think because the focus is keeping the peace. The sense of emergency about our climate, I don't think has penetrated the thinkers and the planners.
When I was thinking about it this morning, was the parallels between how globally we are behaving towards our environmental security and how members of Europe are behaving towards their collective physical security are remarkably similar. When it comes to things like climate change, one should look at these as all parts of the same large diagram. So if one thinks about the difficulty of getting all the NATO states to contribute the 2% of GDP towards their own militaries and towards NATO, it's exactly the same debate that is being had in large ways about countries contributing towards reducing their CO2 impacts, towards reducing their contributions to global warming. What we're seeing is that there are some countries which overachieve, but that overachievement is often more than offset by free riders. And free riding is very damaging to the collective security, whether that's of defence or of the climate. And the more countries that free ride, the more difficult it is to achieve the overall effect that you were after. So I think there's absolutely a connection between the two, that the youth of today is absolutely right to focus on that.
For our students, environmental concerns have fed skepticism about nuclear weapons. The changing nature of warfare and emerging security challenges, such as hybrid war, mean that the West has to develop new forms of deterrence. Are nuclear weapons even relevant anymore? And what does deterrence look like in the context of the 21st century?